Hello, welcome to Phenomenology. My name is Mark Thorsby, and in this video we're taking a look at Heidegger's book Being in Time. In particular, we're looking at Division One, Part Three, the Worldhood of the World. This is Part Two. So if you're just watching this video, make sure to watch the previous one right before it if you haven't already. We're starting off with paragraph 18 of Heidegger's text, in which he's talking about the involvement and significance and its relationship to the worldhood of the world. Okay, so welcome back, everyone. Now, I'm just going to jump right into it, just so we can keep going. I want to get this out there and post it for you guys as soon as possible. The first thing is when we talk about, we've been talking about the involvement that Dasein has in the ready to hand, right? So something is ready to hand insofar as it's available for use, right? And that means that, and of course I recognize these things in terms of the signs, in terms of signs and references and so on and so forth. But all of it is organized around a fundamental principle of involvement. And so what does it mean? What does it mean to be involved with things? And what does it mean to have significance regarding things? Because ideally we're involved with things that are significant, right? Or at least every Dasein is. So number one here is the state which is constitutive for the ready to hand as equipment is one of reference or assignment, right? So if we're to talk about something as a state of being, right? The state of being that's something that's given to ready to hand. So I have the pen, and the pen's just sitting on the desk, and I understand it because I can reference the idea that it is for me to use it to do something else. So it has a reference logic to it, or I can assign, as it were, even a value to it, or assign a referential task to why I need these sorts of things around me. I mean, of course, some things I don't really need around me. For instance, you can't see, but behind the computer is a window. And the window I can open and close. But for instance, while I'm giving this lecture, I don't recognize that. Nothing is assigned to it, as it were, until I sort of call it out into attention. So the state which is constitutive for the ready to the hand as equipment is one of reference or assignment. Now, the indicating of the sign and the hammering of the hammer are not properties of entities. So when I talk about the way in which these beings in the ready to hand indicate certain tasks and purposes for me, that those tasks are not in the object, right? They're not a part of that. This is, if you will, characteristic of me, of Dasein. So anything ready to hand is appropriate for some purpose. For anything ready to hand is appropriate for some purposes and inappropriate for others. And its properties are, as it were, still bound up in these ways in which it's appropriate or inappropriate, right? So the character of being, which belongs to the ready to hand, is involvement, right? That's really at the core of what he's talking about here. We might say that I'm ultimately involved in all of these things. That, number five, that in which it is involved is the towards which of serviceability and the for which of usability, right? So this thing is usable for a specific task and it's serviceable towards certain task, right? I use it towards certain things. So we get a towards which and a for which. By the way, this is where Heidegger's language just gets difficult. And I think he knows it himself, but he's not sure how else to proceed. So we have this sort of important distinction here. Now, number six, though, this primary towards which is not just another towards this as something in which an involvement is possible. The primary towards which is a for the sake of which, right? But for the sake of which always pertains to the being of Dasein. So the idea here is that when I recognize that I can use this towards some task, that task is not just random. That task is organized by me, by the being of Dasein. So seven, letting an entity be involved, letting an entity be involved or getting involved with an entity consists in previously freeing it for its ready-to-handness within the environment, right? And our concern encounters it as the thing that is ready to hand. Number nine, an involvement is itself discovered only on the basis of the prior discovery of a totality of involvements, right? And you can see here, Heidegger is just systematically describing the way in which we actually sort of operate in the world, right? In which we have manners and modes of involvement that are organized by our concern. And there's a whole totality of involvements that we have with the world, and things get placed and organized accordingly, right? Because it's in this totality of involvements, which has been discovered beforehand, there always lurks an ontological relationship to the world. Because and here you can see this is where Heidegger is trying to transition from his discussion of the environment, which is what all of this stuff has been up to this point, into a discussion of the world. I mean, he's been talking about worldhood, of course. So there's an important quote that I think is helpful from 86 of the Heidegger pagination. He writes, "The wherein of an active understanding which assigns or refers itself is that for which one lets entities be encountered in the kind of being that belongs to involvements." And this wherein is the phenomena of the world. And the structure of that to which Dasein assigns itself is what makes up the worldhood of the world, right? So we finally get, because we've been asking this question, especially in the previous video, about, okay, there's entities that are in the world, but we don't have an experience of the world itself. So what is the world? Well, the world is the world is the wherein, in which is the phenomenal wherein that I'm living in terms of my involvement, right? And the structure of that involvement ultimately is related to the worldhood of the world, right? And the structure is fundamentally one that is readiness to hand, right? Or Zuhandenheit, right? So Dasein, in its familiarity with significance, is the ontical condition for the possibility of discovering entities which are encountered in a world with involvement as their kind of being, and which can thus make themselves known as they are in themselves. Dasein, insofar as it is, has always submitted itself to a world which it encounters, and this submission belongs essentially to its being. So you can see here, Heidegger is finally starting to lay out some of the really important distinctions for us, which is when we talk about Dasein, the being for whom being is an issue, fundamental to that being is the fact that Dasein submits itself to the world in terms of a continual manner of involvement. And you can see here that this is where, for instance, the discussion of instrumentality is not very helpful here. Okay. Now, there's a couple things that Heidegger thinks we have to keep distinct, that we need to keep clear about. Because within our present field of investigation, the following structures and dimensions of ontological problematics, as we've repeatedly emphasized, must be kept in principle distinct. So number one, we have the being of those entities within the world, which we proximally encounter readiness to hand. Number two, we have to keep that distinct from, two, the being of those entities which can come across and whose nature can be determined if we discover them in their own right by going through the entities proximally encountered present at hand, right? So we have a way in which beings or entities in the world, and I just encounter them in the ready to hand, but there is a way in which I also encounter entities in the present at hand. Now, number three, the being of that ontical condition, which makes it possible for entities within the world to be discovered at all the worldhood of the world, right? So that is, we have to keep the ready to hand encounter separate from the present hand. We have to keep those two separate from Dasein itself. Dasein herself, I guess you might say. Okay. Now, that concludes section A of Heidegger's sort of analysis of the worldhood. Now, in section B, what he wants to do is he's going to use Descartes in Descartes' meditations and his conception of the world as res extensia, as a contrasting point, as a place to jump off and show how he's doing something very different. I mean, he also offers a very seminal and really big, large, important critique of Descartes, quite unsettling. But what we're going to have to do here is, what he's going to do is section B is he wants to understand the definition of the world as extension, as res extensia. He wants to understand, too, the foundations of this ontological definition, and then finally he's going to give us a hermeneutic discussion. That is, he's going to interpret it and tell us what it means according to, obviously, his philosophy, right? So, paragraph 19. The definition of the world is res extensia. Now, Descartes has a famous dualism here. It's the dualism between mind and world, right? And in Descartes' language, this is the difference between the ego cogito, right? This is the I think, from the res corporea, the world, right? And what Heidegger says is really the difference for us between spirit and nature, and as he will refer to it later. Now, and most of this is his analysis of Descartes, and we're going to see it flow for a while, and it's really brilliant, actually. It was fun to reread all this as I was preparing for the video today. Descartes' term for the being of an entity is substantia, right? He uses, and he, of course, this Heidegger, who's like all great Greek 19th century and 20th century philosophers, is well read up on his classics. And he's actually quoting the original Cartesian Latin, in which Descartes uses the term substantia, or substance. Now, there's two different ways that this term can be meant. One, substantia, Descartes seems to refer to substance in terms of an entity as being a substance, and then also the entity itself, right? And this is to compare Aristotle's conception of ousia, or substance, where Aristotle distinguishes between matter and form, right? The essence of something versus the being, the factual matter of fact of something, right? So first off, Descartes is using this really medieval conception, which is going to become problematic for him, but we can't blame Descartes for that. Now, when he talks about the world, because remember, this is in the section of the worldhood of the world, and we've been talking about Dasein's involvement, ready-to-hand involvement with the world. Descartes defines the world as res corporea, that is, extension in space. And this makes sense from the Cartesian perspective, because what makes this thing corporeal and real? Well, it seems to take up space, right? It has length, it has breadth, it has thickness. All of these are extension, right? And of course, this is because every substance gives attributes, and these attributes denote distinctive properties, and then we can get the essence of something. And this is what he's doing when he talks about the world and its corporeality. But the idea is, for Descartes, is that the essence of the world is demonstrated by showing that all the modes of the world are modifications of extension, right? Is that at the root, anything that's in the world in a bodily sense is a world, the worldhood is just extension. Now, there's the modes and the modifications of extension include a lot of things. They include shape and motion, for instance. The shape of something is clearly a type of extension, but motion is also extension, except it's an extension in terms of a change of location, right? So matter can have definite characteristics, for instance, hardness, weight, color, but these can be subtracted, and yet we still say that something can have matter, right? Thus, matter must essentially be a mode of extension. So what makes up the being of res corporea is the extension, or the extensio. So in any corporeal thing, the real entity is what is suited for, thus remains constant. Okay? So sort of move forward here. Okay, chapter 20, or paragraph 20. Foundations of the ontological definition of the world. Now, here I want to do a real brief overview of Descartes' meditations. I should say that Heidegger does not do this overview. He assumes you know it, but I'm going to give it to you anyway. And check out my Descartes video if you want to see it. But Descartes' meditations take sort of there's 6 meditations in Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy. And they ultimately concern with the idea of going from the idea of the mind to the world. And ultimately, he uses this bridge of God, and we're going to see that's kind of important. All right, in Meditation 1, Descartes doubts all things that can be doubted. We have the absolute doubt. In meditation, and this is a very short summary, so again, this is not a substitute for actually reading it. In Meditation 2, we get Descartes discovers the certainty of the cogito, right? He discovers the idea that I think, therefore I am, or I think I exist. And which means that we have a centrality of the cogito. He talks about the wax here as well. And in section 3, Descartes then catalogs the different types of ideas that are possible within the mind by the cogito. And he recognizes that there are at least 2 ways in which we have an innate idea of God's existence. And in section 4, Descartes talks about error in judgment, and really recognizes that error occurs when we race ahead of our judgment, really. And we don't perceive things as clearly and distinctly. And 5, he gives the ontological argument, an ontological argument for God's existence. And then finally, with chapter 6, because God cannot be a deceiver, right? There is certainty of the world, and it's in really meditation 6 where Descartes discusses at length the distinction between the world and the mind, and in particular, he discusses at length the idea of extension. So, in his view, though, both the mind and the world are substances, but they're dualistic. They're two different types of substances. The world is a substance of extension, and the mind is a substance of thought. It's a substance characterized by cogitations, right? By the thinking thing that I am, right? And all of it depends upon the certainty and objectivity of God's existence. Now, it's a really quick, brief overview, but at least I want to sort of set the stage and prime you for Heidegger's discussion and critique, ultimately, of Descartes. So what is Heidegger's analysis? Well, by substance, we can understand nothing else than an entity which is in such a way that it needs no other entity in order to be, right? So from Descartes' perspective, a substance is a substance insofar as it doesn't have to be anything else, right? It doesn't need anything else for its substantial quality as it's such. So the being of a substance is characterized by not needing anything, right? So it's a negative conception of a substance for Descartes. Now, being is to be understood within a horizon which ranges from the production of what is to be present at hand to something which has no need of being produced. Okay, so when we talk about being of things, you can see that it ranges all these different ways, from the present at hand to something which has no need to be produced, right? Remember, the cogito, I think, therefore I am, is to put my own existence into the present at hand, right? Now, every entity which is not God is ens creatum. Now, this creates a sort of problem, right? And it's interesting that Heidegger discusses this, and it's also important to remember that Heidegger is trained in Catholic theology here as well, even though he himself was rejected the faith. He says here that from the perspective of Descartes in medieval philosophy that he's using in his language, right, to say that a substance is something that doesn't need anything is really only true for one major substance, and that's God. Everything else needs God because everything else is a result of God's creation. And remember, because of the role that God plays in Descartes' argument, this is going to create a little bit of instability at the end of the day. But Descartes' not too worried about it, but you'll see Heidegger sort of exposing it. Now remember, there's two types of substances, the res cogitans and the res extensia, right? Extension and thought. Now here's where Heidegger talks about God. He says, well, when we say God is and the world is, we assert being, because we're using the is, which is our copula, and is always refers to being, but clearly the word is meant in two different ways, because the being of God is fully independent, and the world's being is dependent in terms of creation. Now, whether or not you agree with, God's existence or you're an atheist doesn't matter at this point, because we're just articulating the difference of being that is meant by these philosophers. We're not saying that God is or isn't, right? But the word is getting meant in two different ways. So when I say God is and the world is, I'm on the one hand, I'm still talking about being, and I'm understanding something about being, but I'm meaning it in a different way. Now, Heidegger, in Heidegger's PhD, his dissertation was actually on a medieval philosopher, Duns Scotus. And so he's aware of this, and he says, well, the medieval schoolmen, these medieval philosophers, were really aware of this, and they knew this, and using Aristotle as a jumping off point, distinguished and argued that being is analogical, is that it's ultimately an analogy as opposed to other logical formations that are possible. But notice Descartes just avoids the question, or if he doesn't avoid it, he doesn't know about it, or he doesn't ask it. Or I think he probably does know all of this, but he's just not talking about it because he wants to be pithy, and he is. But he ultimately sort of avoids this whole question, which really problematizes things, especially when you look, for instance, the ontological argument. Okay, um, so the meaning of being remains unclarified but self-evident. Descartes argues that the ontological question of a substance is in and for itself inaccessible from the outset. Being itself does not affect us, and therefore it can't be perceived, right? And being is treated here as not is um, well, let's go back here. Descartes argues that the ontological question of substance is in and for itself inaccessible from the outside, right? I can never know what being itself is. All the best I've got is extension, right? Being doesn't present itself to us. It doesn't affect us, so I can't perceive it. This is why later on Kant would argue that being's not a real predicate. Remember when we say that if I say the grass is green, I'm predicating greenness to my subject grass. And the idea here is when I say that God is, Kant saying is not a real predicate. You're not really connecting anything there. And so you can see here that Kant, from Heidegger's perspective, is really just falling in line with Descartes' insistence to skip over a question about the proximity of being itself. Being is not, in fact, accessible as an entity. It's expressed merely through these attributes. Now, the substantiality of the world, that which is corporeal, has to be assigned to extension. So substantiality is the primary motivating reason behind the postulation of res extensia, right? Ultimately, we have to have these substances, and this need for substantiality is ultimately what's undergirding this argument from Descartes' perspective regarding extension. So substance is really what's at the core here, and substance is understood in two ways through a characteristic of an entity, right? On the one hand, the characteristic is also an entity, right? So we get a profound confusion here, an equivocation. So I sort of drafted up a thing here to show you what it means. So let's take a substance. Let's imagine we have a cup. Take a drink again. We have a cup. Well, what makes this thing a substance? Well, Descartes' answer is that it's extension in space. But here's the problem, is Descartes treats extension as an entity that then defines the substance of an entity as a substance. So you end up with a profound confusion where you have equivocations, where you're treating the extension as an entity, but you're using extension to define what an entity is, because it's fundamental to being a substance. So you end up with this sort of circular argument at the end of the day, right? Because being is actually being used in two different senses. And this is important because we see that there's a difference between the ontological, the ontical, and the ontico-ontological. And later on, Heidegger would become well known for what's known as the ontological difference. The difference between beings as entities and being as such. I like to say beings with a lowercase b and being with a capital B, right? And this is the ontological difference. And ultimately, this is the problem of Descartes' argument. He's breaking the ontological difference, right? And he's equivocating two different types of being. Now, a great place to sort of look at some of this comes from Monday's Glossary of Being and Time. Here's the URL if you want to pause the video and take a look at it. Sorry, I can't zoom in very well. On the one hand, when we talk about the ontical inquiries are concerned with knowledge about entities, right? The ontical concerns the being with a lowercase b, whereas the ontological concerns being with a capital B, right? Monday writes, Heidegger uses ontology in a specific sense as being synonymous with his phenomenological method, right? So we're not going to go into all that. And then there's the ontological, but I'm not going to go through that. But take a look. There's some great resources here. I thought I'd just throw them up for you real fast. Okay, paragraph 21 is the hermeneutical discussion of the Cartesian ontology of the world. So what is Heidegger's evaluation of Descartes here? Well, the first question, does the ontology of the world for Descartes seek the phenomena of the world at all? No. Right? Does it define some entity within the world fully enough so that the worldly character of this entity can be made visible? The answer, no. right? There's a problem here, which is namely, Descartes is ultimately trying to understand with extension something which is proximally and for the most part ready at hand, nature, right? He's trying to understand the nature of things, but the nature of things begins and is understood in terms of their use. That's the ready at hand. Um, so you can see what's going on here. And it goes to the idea that Descartes is privileging the present at hand, so much so that he's excluded any form of the ready at hand, right? Descartes' conception of the world is ontologically defective, according to Heidegger. He thinks that um, what Descartes' done is that he's passed over the phenomena of the world, which, by the way, is very common for Dasein, right? He mentions that at the beginning, right? So for Descartes, the only genuine access to being lies in knowing, in terms of intellectio, right? That's the Latin term that gets used there, right? In intellection, here's a type of knowing, and here Descartes is, of course, a good contrast is to think about mathematical knowledge, right? Something is known in mathematics, and when it is, it's something which remains constant, right? It doesn't change, right? That's one of the beauties of mathematics, is that, for instance, the sets of prime numbers are always going to be the same. They're never going to change, right? That which enduringly remains is, right? So the idea here is mathematical knowledge has being because it never changes and it's constant. Well, this is a form of the present at hand, right? So the intellectio, the sort of knowledge that Descartes' after in terms of the world, is one that automatically privileges the present at hand, right? His ontology is oriented by this ontological orientation, and it is at the core what Heidegger is ultimately objecting to, right? He says, quote, Descartes knows very well that entities do not proximally show themselves in their real being, right? And here we can consider the wax example that Descartes gives. Remember, when I have the wax, the wax is not given to me through the attributes of its sensation, the sensations I have. The wax is given to me through a unity provided through the mind, right? This comes in the second meditation. So that means that for Descartes, what I know about entities, the entities don't really show themselves. They're really hidden, actually, right? Quote, the senses do not enable us, well, the senses do not enable us to cognize any entity in its being. They merely serve to announce the ways in which external things within the world are useful or harmful for human creatures encumbered with bodies. So we get hardness gets taken as a resistance, or consider the idea that hardness gets taken as a resistance, but hardness always assumes that beings are involved in the world, right? So how do I know that this book has, here it is, being and time, right? How do I know that this book has extension in space? Well, because it has a hardness to it, right? And that's how I know that it has this extension. But the hardness of the book presumes that there's a world that I'm involved with the book. And this is the part that Descartes is completely bracketed out. It's what Descartes has subtracted from his analysis, and this is why his ontology is ultimately suspicious and defective, because Descartes is presuming, Descartes wants everything to be the present at hand, but he has to presume the ready to hand without actually talking about it, which means that everything that's ready to hand in his philosophy gets forced and contorted and rounded off, Heidegger says, into something that's a present at hand natural objectivity. So you can see there's this really profound confusion going on with Descartes' meditations. And by the way, it's with all the philosophers here, from Heidegger's perspective, right? Descartes' solution to the problem of the mind and the world, right, which is God, actually made it impossible. His solution isn't just mind and God, but it's the solution of res extensia and corporeality, right? But this has made it impossible to lay bare the primordial ontological problematic of Dasein. That is, we can't even ask the question of what it means to be a being that asks about being. It's not possible because it's been completely bracketed off. It's been cut off from the analysis, right? So Descartes ontologically rounds off the form of being of the ready to hand into objects of nature. So things that are normally given to me in terms of their use turn into natural objects, which are given as the present at hand. And this is the way it works. You can never go backwards, which means that you can never make an account of Dasein's being in the world, right? So there's four big questions that we have to ask, or that Heidegger insists that we ask here, which is one: what was the phenomenon of the world passed over at the beginning of the ontological tradition, and why does it keep occurring? I think that's supposed to be a why, not what. Why was the phenomena of the world passed over at the beginning of the ontological tradition, and why do we keep passing over it? And we're going to see it has something to do, importantly, with Dasein itself, or herself. Two, why is it that entities within the world have intervened as an ontological theme, right? Number three, why are these entities found in the first instance of nature? And four, why has recourse been taken to the phenomena of value when it has seemed necessary to round out such an ontology of the world? So these are four really big questions, but I'm not going to try to answer them here, but we'll see over the course of Being and Time, Heidegger will answer them, right? P.S. though, Heidegger actually says that he thinks that Descartes' analysis of the world as res extensia can actually be rescued. He's not completely wrong. So there's a sort of nod to the master there, as it were, in which it's clear that the spatiality of Dasein, there is a way in which there is extension. And so is there a way that we could rescue, as it were, an existential analysis out of Descartes' work? Now, this moves to the third section of the third part, the worldhood of the world, and that concerns the aroundness of the environment and Dasein's spatiality. And to be honest, this is when things really start getting interesting in Being in Time. Now, we should notice here that we've been contrasting Dasein, when we talk about Dasein's spatiality, we've been contrasting Dasein with the sort of conception of the inside. We've been talking about the aroundness, and so there must be an insideness, right? Where we have sort of there's something that's in and there's something outside. Both of these get taken as a sort of present at hand, right? And this means that we'll quote, we must show how the aroundness of the environment, the specific spatiality of entities encountered in the environment, is rounded upon the worldhood of the world, while contrariwise, the world on its part is not present at hand in space. So we've got to figure out how to do these things. And so there's three topics, if you will, that Heidegger says we got to address, and that he's going to address in the next three paragraphs, which is one, the spatiality of the ready to hand within the world. So what does it mean for us to have space in the world, in the ready to hand, in terms of our modes of involvement? Number two, we have to look at the spatiality of being in the world within the world, right? And then number three, what's the space and the spatiality of Dasein? I have two typos in a row, my apologies. And so those are going to be the sort of directions he goes in 22, 23, and 24. Now, the spatiality of the ready to hand within the world, let's start there. What does it mean to talk about spatiality here? Now, he begins by asking, how have we already come close to a concept of space in terms of the ready to hand? Well, consider this language of proximally. We've been talking about the idea of something as proximally and for the most part available to us in terms of use. Proximity here refers to, well, what? It refers to closeness, the degree to which something is close to me. And closeness here is always given in terms of a certain type of involvement, right? So closeness here, he says, is regulated by circumspectly calculative, manipulating, and using, right? So closeness, how I know if the book is close to me, depends upon my circumspection and my calculation in terms of how I can use something, right? And of course, closeness, whoa, I'm sorry, I'm using the Prezi program, and it drives me nuts sometimes. But when we talk about closeness, that means we also talk about directionality, right? Directionality is signified not by a present at hand position, not by a point in space-time, right? But by the equipment as essentially fitted up and installed, set up, and put to rights, right? So the way in which I recognize my direction, if we're thinking in terms of the ready to hand, is always in terms of my involvement with things. And my involvement with things concerns the space in which things are installed and working and useful and available to me, right? And that means that when we talk about closeness and directionality, that means we give way to the notion of region. there's regions of involvement. Now, these regions here, he's giving, if you will, a phenomenological characterization of spatiality for Dasein when it's in a ready-to-hand comportment. And there are certain regions that Dasein finds itself within, right? Equipment has its place, and there's a definite there and a yonder, right? Place here, of course, is determined, or the region is determined insofar as things belong, insofar as I recognize the way in which things belong together, the way in which things hang together, if you will. So Heidegger really begins to introduce a conceptual lexicon for the spatiality of the ready-to-hand. And so we get three real big terms that are really important for you to become accustomed to and work with. And that's the notion of directionality, direction, region, and remoteness. And he's going to talk about all of these, and I'm going to mention remoteness here in just a minute. All of these three terms are spatial terms for thinking about Dasein's circumspect involvement, the way in which Dasein gets involved. And so, for instance, think right here. You're sitting here watching this. What's above you is what's on the ceiling. What's below you is what's on the floor. What's behind you is the door. What's in front of you is the window, or whatever, right? Notice that how you describe your above, below, your foreground, your background, all that sort of stuff depends upon your mode of involvement, right? Why did I say door rather than wall, right? There is a wall behind me. And you can see I chose that term in terms of what's closest or proximally close to my concern, to my dealings with things, right? And so the spatial terms that Heidegger introduces are always organized according to this proximal involvement, right? Regions are not present at hand places, right? These aren't places on a map, right? The places are something that's designated by Dasein's concern, right? The readiness to hand which belongs to any such region beforehand has the characteristic of inconspicuous familiarity. So when I'm in a region and I'm using things, right, everything is inconspicuously familiar, right? And if it's not, then that takes me out of the ready to hand, right, and pops me into the present to hand, as it were. So the space of Dasein's circumspect being in the world actually is the totality of equipment, right? So the space of all this involvement is, the space of my circumspect being in the world is actually the totality of all these things that I'm involved with, this equipment. And the environment is arranged by the context of the involvement that Dasein has. And those change with the various types of Dasein, right? Or the different types of people in the world, right? So, okay, looking at paragraph 23. The spatiality of being in the world. So now we know what Heidegger means when he talks about the spatiality of Dasein's ready to hand. But what about our being in the world? We're beings that are existing in the world. So what does that mean? Well, Dasein's spatiality, as we've already said, concerns involvement and familiarity. Now there's two key characteristics he's going to talk about: disseverance and directionality. We'll come to directionality here at the end. Let's start with disseverance. Let's start here with the term. To sever means to break apart, right? So to dissever means to bring together. Or as he puts it, it means to make the farnish vanish. Now, I put intentionality here. Heidegger doesn't use that term, and he doesn't even reference it. But think about intentionality here, and think about that when I direct my consciousness towards the cup, right? The farness of the cup, the cup becomes closer to me in terms of my involvement, right? And that is a mode of disseverance. So when we talk about Dasein's being in the world, Dasein's being in the world exists in terms of its disseverant quality, right? And this enables us to discover the notions of distance and remoteness. So I recognize that things are distant from me or remote from me insofar as I can dissever things. Now, disseverance here, he says, needs to be understood both in terms of an active and a transitive sense. So on the one hand, disseverance is making the farnish vanish, but on the other hand, disseverance is an existential. It's an existential characteristic of Dasein's involvement as a being in the world. Okay, so in Dasein, there lies an essential tendency towards closeness. Dasein always wants to become closer to things because in the ready to hand, that's the mode of involvement. So Dasein's being in the world is always one of closing the farness gap, as it were, right? And think here about the technological tendencies of the modern world and the way in which there's a movement of disseverance in response to remoteness, right? Now, of course, for Heidegger, his example here was the radio and the telephone. For us, right, we can think of the internet and the Twitter. We can think of Twitter. We can think of Facebook. All of these are functions, are technological means for allowing Dasein to dissever that which is remote. So, for instance, there's a war in Syria going on right now. Horrible catastrophes are occurring. Perhaps genocides are taking place, right? And through technological means, I can dissever and make that which is that sort of event come close to me. I can have the farnish vanish. So this is very interesting, and this really initiates a sort of first, maybe a little bitty point in which Heidegger begins to give us an analysis of a philosophy of technology. He eventually does that later. We're not going to talk about that here in Being in Time, but you can see he does begin to talk about the way in which the technological medium works. So, for instance, I'm here in Houston recording this. You're wherever you are, but through this technological medium, we are dissevering. We're able to dissever the remoteness between us, right? Remoteness, though, is not a distance, right? So consider when someone says, let's take a walk and it's going to take 30 minutes. 30 minutes is not a time, it's a duration, right? It's a duration. It's a duration in which the distance gap closes, right? So remoteness are estimated proximately by circumspection. So I recognize how remote something is, ultimately by my circumspection. And notice that when I call someone on the phone, the remoteness, I can sort of remote in, as it were. I can remotely dissever myself towards them, right? So bringing close or disseverance is always a kind of concernful being towards what is brought close or dissevered. Objective distances in the present to hand is not the remoteness of what is ready to hand. So when I say I'm driving to New York and it's going to take me 300 miles, that is very different from describing how long it felt like it took to get to New York, right? Notice here that when you first drive somewhere, it seems to take a long time, and when you've driven it a million times, it gets shorter and shorter. Why? Well, that's because the disseverance gap is closed, or is further closed the more repetitiously one does it, right? And there's other reasons too, but we won't go into all that. But be careful not to pass off this with the idea that means that it's all subjective, right? Dasein's spatiality is not purely a matter of subjectivity. In fact, we really need to jettison the language of subjectivity and objectivity eventually, right? The circumspective dissevering of Dasein's everydayness reveals the being in itself of the true world, of that entity which Dasein, as something existing, is already alongside. So when we talk about dissevering here, we're actually talking about the way the world really is, the reality of the world in its most fundamental sense. And think about, for instance, when someone takes a walk. And by the way, here's a picture of Heidegger actually taking a walk in the Black Forest. But Heidegger at this point writes this just beautiful passage on 107. He writes, quote, "So too, for instance, does the street as equipment for walking. One feels the touch of it at every step as one walks. It's seemingly the closest and the realest of all that's ready to hand, and it slides itself, as it were, along certain portions of one's body, the soles of one's feet. And yet it is farther remote than the acquaintance of whom one encounters on the street at a remoteness of 20 paces when I'm walking, when one is taking such a walk." So what is he talking about here? Well, disseverance here is a phenomenological category, which means that we're not talking about, and by the way, distance, and he'll talk about distantiality and all this, but disseverance in the spatiality of Dasein has to be phenomenologically understood, such that, for instance, when I'm walking on the street, in a very real sense, the street itself is really the thing that's closest to me, and it really is quite real. But in terms of my mode of involvement, and I see someone walking, say, I see my beautiful wife walking down the street, and I recognize her, suddenly the street feels like the physical street I'm standing on feels like the thing that's furthest from me, and because now my involvement is completely zoomed in on this other person, right? So you can see here that when we're talking about the spatiality of Dasein, we're talking about Dasein's modality of involvement. We're not talking about measuring things. We're talking about, if you will, the intentional comportment we have towards things. And think about what's happening next time when you walk. And think about when you're walking, or think about a person who's on a phone walking, right? They're more conscious of what they're deseverantly bringing out of remoteness through Facebook if they're looking at their mobile phone than they are of the actual street. We've all seen those videos where someone walking on mobile phones walks into a wall. That's because what's around them is actually what's furthest from them because their involvement is somewhere else. Okay, it's interesting because Heidegger, of course, he was living through their own technological shift in the 20th century, but in many ways, his discussion of Dasein's phenomenological involvement is apropos, essential for understanding the way in which we today are involved with technology. So as a being in the world, Dasein maintains itself essentially in a dissevering character. Dasein is essentially disseverance. That is, Dasein is spatial. Dasein is spatiality. Now, I said we'd come to directionality. So what does directionality mean then? Well, every bringing close already has a directionality. So in order to bring something close, there has to be a directionality. And also notice here that intentionality is the directedness of consciousness. So Dasein's direction is given according to the signs that it recognizes in its involvement, given the region that Dasein's in or at. And out of this directionality, it's the directions of left, right, etc. generated. So these, what we can consider to be the present to hand directionalities, like left and right, up and down, right? These things which appear to be three dimensions in space and all of this, these are grounded within Dasein's phenomenological sense of directionality and spatiality, right? That's where they're generated from. Dasein takes its spatialization according to its body, and the directionality of disseverance is founded upon Dasein's being in the world, upon Dasein's doing something in the world, factically, right? So left and right are not something subjective, and they're not mere feelings, right? So we should really resist this temptation to think of Dasein spatiality and the spatiality of the world as a sort of subjective quality, as a feeling, as a perception, because it's not, right? Though there is a way in which we could talk about there being subjective states that accompany these things. That's not fundamentally what it is, because we'll see this becomes a part of his language. We're thrown into the world. Now, the spatiality of Dasein still lacks the pure multiplicity of three dimensions. So is there a way in which we can sort of understand how these three dimensions, space as such, is generated with regards, and what's the relationship to Dasein's spatiality? So space always is reference to a region for Dasein, the whither of Dasein, and every region is a region insofar as it allows certain forms of belongingness. The way in which these tools go here, and the way in which I comport myself and involve myself towards things. And the belongingness of things gives me the hither and to the thither of things. So you can see here is that it's my mode of involvement that's doing the work at the end of the day. He writes, when we let entities within the world be encountered in the way in which is constitutive for being in the world, we give them space. Right? So the spatiality in this three-dimensional sense is a phenomenological is derivative of the phenomenological spatiality that Heidegger is trying to articulate here. Space is not in the subject, nor is it in the world. Nor is the world in space. Space is rather in the world insofar as space has been disclosed by that being in the world which is constitutive for Dasein. So space exists in the world insofar as Dasein gives their space in the world. And here you can think of suddenly, of course, think about Immanuel Kant's transcendental aesthetic. We're going to see that this is not what he's after, and he'll talk about Kant later in the book, right? He does argue that space is a priori, but not in Kant's way. What's a priori here means, for Heidegger, the previousness with which space, that should be not space, but space, the previousness which with space has been encountered as a region whenever the ready to hand is encountered environmentally. Okay? So it's a priori. It comes beforehand. Now, the three-dimensional spatiality transforms a space of involvement into a homogeneous space of nature. The roundness of the world gets lost. And notice here that the way in which the roundness of the world that we're sort of describing here in terms of Dasein's environmental spatiality is very different than the spatiality we see on a map, where there is no point where anything is around. Everything just happens to be just there. It just lies there, right? So the three-dimensional spatiality that we can arrive at in the present to hand ultimately irons out the roundness of the world, right? So the three-dimensionality of space ultimately is derivative from Dasein's spatiality as a phenomenological comportment, right? But once we adopt that three-dimensional spatiality, we can, as it were, destroy or reduce or lose this more original primordial sense of spatiality. Here's what he argues on 113. Unless we go back to the world, space cannot be conceived. Space becomes accessible only if the environment is deprived of its worldhood. And spatiality is not discoverable at all except on the basis of the world. Indeed, space is still one of the things that is constitutive for the world, just as Dasein's own spatiality is essential to its basic state of being in the world. So you can see here Heidegger is ultimately trying to wrap this up and for us to recognize a very new and a different conception of spatiality and to see how essential that conception is. And also, it's one that's easily passed over. So next time, in the next video, we'll be looking at section 4, being in the world as being with and being oneself, and the they. So that's what we're going to talk about others in the world as well next time. So thank you guys very much for watching. I apologize these videos are long, but hopefully you're getting something out of them. So I'll see you guys online. Thanks for watching.